It seems obvious that if a company wants to know what consumers desire, they should just ask them. But human memory is notoriously faulty, and our answers change depending on our mood. Without a strict mechanism to extract it, raw consumer feedback is just contradictory noise. To get clean, usable data, researchers rely on a highly engineered scientific instrument, the questionnaire. Unless you build a rigid architectural framework to capture and organize human opinions, the answers you get are entirely useless to the people making corporate decisions. The first crucial step in any research project is deciding the shape of the container you want to build. If you need to survey thousands of people, you use a structured format. You lock the possible answers into a rigid grid of closed questions so you can easily aggregate the quantitative data later. Business-to-business studies usually require a semi-structured format. You keep some quantitative metrics, but add flexible text fields to let industry professionals explain their specific reasoning. For deep psychological probes and focus groups, you dissolve the predefined answers entirely. You use an unstructured format, a free-flowing guide of topics that lets the researcher chase an unexpected thought wherever it leads. The structural container you select at the beginning dictates the exact boundary and type of truth you are capable of capturing at the end. Once the overarching structure is built, you drop in the specific questions. The most critical of these are behavioral questions. These ask what people actually do, buy, or visit. Stated opinions can drift, but recorded actions give you an undeniable baseline of facts. For example, a consumer might tell a researcher that they prioritize reliability, fuel efficiency, and a practical price tag above all else when shopping for a vehicle. But a behavioral question tracking their actual spending reveals that this exact same person bypassed the sedans and purchased a bright red Lamborghini. Tracking their actions provided an undeniable fact about their purchase, but it completely fails to explain the invisible emotions driving that choice. To figure out what people are thinking and feeling, researchers deploy attitudinal questions. Emotions are inherently subjective. If you want to use them in a mathematical model, you have to engineer specific scales that force respondents to quantify those vague feelings. This chart shows a Likert scale, requiring users to grade statements from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Another method, the semantic differential scale, maps emotional weight by placing a brand on a spectrum between directly opposing adjectives, like traditional versus modern. The final foundational pillar is the classification question. Researchers call these the Cinderella questions because they are frequently forgotten, yet entirely essential. These capture basic demographic facts like age, gender, and socioeconomic grade. Later on, data analysts will use these exact categories to segment, slice, and cross-tabulate to attitudinal data into distinct profiles. By combining a person's recorded actions, measured thoughts, and demographic identity, researchers can correlate a consumer's background with their intent, building a profile that links who they are to how they are likely to act. Before a single person takes the survey, the individual questions have to be assembled, formulated, and laid out precisely. The questions themselves must follow an absolute rule of simplicity. They should be under 20 words, positively phrased, and completely stripped of technical jargon or leading biases that might skew the answer. The flow through the document is just as vital. You always start with screener questions to filter out irrelevant subjects, followed by a spacious visual layout that prevents the respondent from experiencing fatigue. Next comes piloting. The draft survey is field-tested on a small group to catch any confusing phrasing or structural dead ends before deploying it to the masses. A perfectly written question is entirely useless if the survey's overarching structural flow exhausts or confuses the respondent. For highly complex products, simple questions and basic rating scales are no longer sufficient. Researchers rely on conjoint analysis. Conjoint analysis is a sophisticated modeling technique that computes the exact numerical value consumers place on competing product features, forcing them to balance variables like a lower price against better battery life. They also use trade-off grids. These force respondents to allocate an imaginary budget, showing exactly where improvements should be made and what the market is willing to pay. A meticulously engineered questionnaire transforms the chaotic noise of human opinion into actionable data, providing the statistical confidence required to guide corporate strategy.